Not so ancient poetry. In the late 1700s, readers across Europe got a big kick out of a series of poems purportedly written by Ossian, a legendary Scottish poet and storyteller from the 3rd century. Now, here I need to decide the choice that is most consistent with the style used in the passage, and got a big kick out is extremely informal. So we cannot accept this in a formal passage. So A is out. Were tickled pink is also informal. Got a rush from is also informal. Were thrilled by, right? So to be thrilled by is acceptable. Readers across Europe were thrilled by a series of poems purportedly written by Ossian, a legendary Scottish poet. Ossian was said to have worked in the oral rather than the written tradition, and the French general Napoleon Bonaparte so admired the poems to where he commissioned 2 paintings of Ossian to be hung in his summer palace. Now, which choice provides a supporting example that is more similar to the other example? So we know that Napoleon admired Ossian's poem so much that he commissioned 2 paintings of the artist to be hung in his summer palace. So this part, Ossian was said to have worked in the oral rather than the written tradition, is not really relevant. It's not similar to the example of Napoleon's admiration of him, so it's not A. Literary critics compared Ossian to the revered poets Homer and Dante. So this is a good answer because this tells us the reputation that he enjoyed. He was compared to revered poets such as Homer and Dante, and the French general Bonaparte admired his poems. So this also connects with the other example, so I like B. The poems of Ossian feature well-known characters from other Gaelic poems. So the characters that the poems feature is not relevant here because here we are talking about the esteem in which Ossian was held. And Ossian himself appears in the poems as a narrator. So this again gets into the details of the poems themselves. So B. The French general Napoleon so admired the poems that he commissioned, right? He so admired the poems that he commissioned. So D. This is idiomatic. You need to understand the sentence structure. So to, where, so that, and which, none of these fit the sentence structure. So option D. There was just one problem. The poems were largely the invention of their so-called translator, James Macpherson. Macpherson was a Scottish Highlander who grew up listening to songs and stories in the Gaelic language. When he began his career as a school teacher in Ruthven, Scotland, he set about collecting the tales and ballads of the region. A friend persuaded him to translate the Gaelic poem The Death of Oscar into English, and in 1760 Macpherson published his translation along with translations of several other poems in a volume entitled Fragments of Ancient Poetry. So here I need to decide the correct punctuation, and the way it's written, that he was a Scottish Highlander who grew up listening to songs and stories, that is correct, so no problems here. If I say he grew up listening, then this part is an independent sentence, so that can't come after a comma, so B is wrong. If I say growing up listening, then this part is dependent and it can't come after a semicolon. And he had grown is also independent, so comma usage is wrong, so A. The fragments immediately captured the public's imagination. Equally captivating was Macpherson's hint in the preface that an epic poem, a poem chronicling heroic deeds of great significance to a culture, might be recovered through further study of ancient manuscripts and oral traditions in the Highlands. Excited patrons provided Macpherson with funds to undertake a research trip. They were not disappointed. So here I have 2 independent sentences and I need to connect them, but a comma has been placed between them. So this is a comma splice error. So this is not correct. If I say, meanwhile, they were not disappointed, firstly, meanwhile does not make sense here because meanwhile is used as a connector when I'm talking about another incident that happened at the same time as what we are talking about. And here, the disappointment of the patrons is directly related to the previous sentence. So meanwhile doesn't fit here. Also, if I need to say meanwhile, I should have a semicolon here because meanwhile will start a new sentence. So a comma and an and makes sense here, right? I can say that excited patrons provided Macpherson with funds to undertake a research trip and they were not disappointed. So comma plus and can be used to connect to independent sentences. So this is good. And whereas they were not disappointed, first of all, whereas doesn't fit here because I'm talking about two things that go in the same direction. And the colon also doesn't make sense here because if I'm explaining something, then I cannot start that explanation with whereas. So C. In spite of their contributions, Macpherson published two epic poems, Fingal and Temora, which recounted the feats of ancient Gaelic warriors. Macpherson claimed that the poems had been written by Ossian. So here I'm saying that Macpherson received funds from patrons and they were not disappointed. He published two epic poems, right? So in spite of their contributions doesn't make sense here because it was the contributions that led to the trip and which ultimately led to the publication of the epic poem. So it's not A. Because of this, Macpherson published two epic poems. I don't think because of this fits here because I'm already saying they were not disappointed. So that kind of explains that, whatever Macpherson did was something that the patrons liked. So this is not a good way to start the next sentence. In the years that followed, right? So this makes sense because when I say they were not disappointed, I'm kind of explaining that with saying that, in the years that followed, Macpherson did publish two epic poems. So I like this. To everyone's dismay, that is incorrect because that would indicate that people were not happy, while the paragraph is saying the exact opposite. So C. The influential English author Samuel Johnson demanded to see the original manuscripts that Macpherson had translated. When Macpherson refused, Johnson accused him of fraud and undertook a trip to Scotland to debunk Macpherson's claims. Johnson provided a formal account of his suspicions in his 1775 travel book, A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland. At this point, the writer wants to include an effective transition from the previous paragraph to the rest of the passage. Which choice best accomplishes this goal? So here I'm saying that Macpherson had published two epic poems. And then I'm saying that Samuel Johnson had doubts about the authenticity of the manuscripts. So the Scottish poet Robert Burns may have been influenced by Ossian. So this has no connection with what we are discussing here, the story of Macpherson's fraud. So it's not A. However, a controversy soon arose over the poems. So this makes sense because here I'm saying that the poems were published, and then I'm saying that Samuel Johnson doubted their authenticity. So a controversy soon arose is a good transition statement. Readers assumed that Macpherson was telling the truth. Now, if I'm saying readers assume that Macpherson was telling the truth, then the next part should say, but the influential English author, right? So there should be some contrast here, which is not present. So it's not C. Macpherson's poems were written in English, not the original Gaelic. So that is something that we already know, that he had written the poems in English. So that is no way connected to what we are discussing here. So B. Now, Johnson demanded to see the original manuscripts that Macpherson had translated, right? So this comma is wrong because I'm defining the manuscripts by the fact that they were translated. So it's not A. B is correct. I don't need any punctuation. I can't have a semicolon after that because both sides of the semicolon are not independent sentences. And a comma after that is also wrong. So B. The public remained divided between those who believed in the poem's authenticity and those who agreed with Johnson that the poems were a hoax. Today, it is believed that Macpherson created the Ossian text by combining poetry and stories he had heard on his travels with invented material of his own invention. The writer is considering adding the following sentence: the Ossian incident is mentioned only briefly in James Boswell's 1791 biography, Life of Johnson. Now, here I'm talking about how the public was divided between those who believed Macpherson and those who agreed with Johnson. And then I'm talking about what the situation is like today. So, the fact that this is only briefly mentioned in the biography of Johnson is not relevant. So, I don't want to add this. It fails to establish Boswell's views on the legitimacy of Ossian. No, that's not the point. In fact, a mention of Boswell is not even needed here. No, because it blurs the focus of the paragraph by including extraneous information regarding Johnson, right? So this is information about Johnson that is not relevant to this paragraph. So D. Today, it is believed that Macpherson created the Ossian text by combining poetry and stories he had heard on his travels with invented material of his own invention. So when I'm saying of his own invention, then this invented becomes redundant. It's not needed, so it's not A. So material that he invented or made up material, they are all redundant. I should just say with material of his own invention. Having set out to find an epic poet in the Highlands, he created one by attributing these amalgamated works to the mythic Ossian. Although many modern critics do not share Johnson's hostility towards Macpherson, Johnson was ultimately correct in thinking that poems such as Fingal and Timora are better understood as the work of an 18th century poet than as a 3rd century one. Now, here I'm saying that Johnson was ultimately correct in thinking that poems such as these are better understood as the work of an 18th century poet than as the work of a 3rd century one, right? Because I have to compare work with work. Now, since I don't want to repeat work, I can also say than as that of a 3rd century one, right? So the way it's written is wrong because that's a false comparison. Those is incorrect because work is singular, so the pronoun should also be singular. Then as that of, this is correct. Work of an 18th century poet, then as that of, then as work of a 3rd century one. And compared with is incorrect comparison again because it doesn't compare work with work. So C. Okay, let's grade this. Question 12. DBDACC, DBDACC, BBDDC, BBDDC. Okay, great. So we got all correct.